Hello and welcome to Wisconsin in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I am Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is the Center Square's Wisconsin correspondent, Benjamin Yount. How are you, Ben?
Getting ready for another weekend of football, but it's going to be on hold. Packers play Thursday, no Badger game. That means this is the final week of baseball in my house. 2 games against the Chicago Cubs. I've got tickets to both. It's going to be a blast.
Well, the Brewers are definitely playoff bound. I know that, but I want to go back to the NFL and the Green Bay Packers and remind listeners that you kind of had a dire outlook for the Packers this season. They are playing a division rival, the 2-1 Detroit Lions, a battle for first place on Thursday Night Football. But Ben, I don't know. Your prediction's not looking so good right now.
Yeah, I think I was 6-11, 7-10, somewhere there. Now, look, in my defense, if Derek Carr doesn't get put out of the last game, now the Pack is 1-2. Lions are pretty good. The biggest embarrassment, the thing that I should absolutely be run out of town for, was predicting that the Vikings would win the NFC North. Again, this is why I am a bad gambler. Never take gambling advice from your Uncle Ben. I'm terrible. If I even touch your pull tabs, you won't win. I'm the last person you want to invite to the casino. I'm a lot of fun. I'm cool to hang out with, but don't ever take gambling advice from me. I will bankrupt you.
That has been noted, Ben. I'll make sure I follow that advice. Listen, Ben, election integrity remains a concern mainly for Republicans in Wisconsin. With the new Democratic majority on the state Supreme Court, there are concerns among the GOP that Wisconsin's highest court could overturn certain election integrity measures that are already in place, such as voter ID requirements. Republicans have introduced a pair of constitutional amendments they say will close loopholes or protect the state's electoral process. Tell us about them.
Yeah, this is part of a push, like you said, for election integrity. Though, if you take a look at the plain text, the 4 corners of these pieces of legislation or these 2 constitutional amendments, they don't state election integrity as their goal. One of these constitutional amendments would deal with voter ID. Wisconsin's had voter ID since 2011. This would make sure that it's baked into the Constitution. The other constitutional amendment deals with ERIC, which is the multi-state voter check system. And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole on really hard right conservative Twitter, just type in questions about ERIC and you'll have people running off. Next thing you know, the joke that was made on conservative talk radio is next thing Mike Lindell will be telling you about how voting machines really work. But the main thrust of the second constitutional amendment deals with the Zuckerbucks, right? The Center for Tech and Civic Life, which spent about $9 million here in Wisconsin in the 2020 election. And that constitutional amendment would essentially outlaw outside money for the purposes of elections. You can't, the allegations during Zuckerbucks was that the Center for Tech and Civic Life essentially took over the clerk's office in Green Bay, providing extraordinary access to these outside volunteers, in air quotes. And it's something that, we've talked about this a lot here on Wisconsin in Focus. It was not technically illegal in that there was nothing in state law that said you can't do it, but it was not specifically legal because there was nothing in state law that said you could do it. This constitutional amendment would be very clear. You cannot do it. Now, there are 2 reasons why you are seeing these constitutional amendments and other election integrity pushes. The first is you can't veto a constitutional amendment. Lawmakers have tried to, the Republican-controlled legislature has tried to introduce these pieces of legislation to just simply create new laws to hem in what they saw as abuses from 2020. Governor Evers has made it very clear that he is not going to sign anything that he believes makes it tougher to vote in this state. And so all of these election integrity ideas, they come up, they pass the Assembly, they pass the Senate, they go to the governor's desk and are promptly vetoed. when you change the Constitution, the governor has no say. Passes the Assembly, passes the Senate, then it goes to the voters. And if the voters approve it, guess what? Now it's into the Constitution. The other reason you are seeing this is there continue to be unanswered questions about Wisconsin's electoral process. And in addition to these two constitutional amendments, you've had a couple of pieces of legislation filed, some of which have broad bipartisan support, but all tangentially come back to the 2020 election and the idea of restoring faith in Wisconsin's electoral system.
Going back to the process, this is just a proposal at this point. It's not certain that voters will face this question at the ballot box, but it takes just a majority of those in the Assembly and of those in the Senate to approve it to get it on the ballot. Does it need super majorities?
Honest to God, I'm not sure what it needs in the Senate. The Republicans have the votes, is what I know. Okay. This is the second time around for the voter ID constitutional amendment. I know that. The idea is that will be on the ballot in the spring of 2024. So next April, that one will likely be before voters. And these are things that poll pretty well here in Wisconsin. The top Democrat in the Wisconsin Senate said of this, and we quoted her, Melissa Agard out of Madison. We quoted her in the piece as saying that this is part of the continued Republican attempt to sow seeds of doubt about elections in Wisconsin. But the reality is we've had voter ID in the state for over a decade. It is extremely easy to get an ID card for voting purposes. You can walk into any DMV, I think, with a piece of mail and something that proves who you are, credit card or a birth certificate, and you will walk out that day with a voter ID. Even during the coronavirus, you were able to go to the DMV when you couldn't do anything else at the DMV. You could go in during the height of COVID and get a voter ID for the purposes of voting in the state. So it's very easy. It's an idea that is very, very popular. It's been the law for years. And really, you said it in the intro. The impetus behind voter ID is the sort of blanket fear that an awful lot of Republicans have in Wisconsin of, all right, the Protasiewicz court is clearly going to have a liberal/progressive bend. We've got to protect the stuff because God only knows what the wish list is to change. And, so once you put it in the Constitution, it can't be changed. There's also a whole conversation about using the Wisconsin Constitution as opposed to the U.S. Constitution and new federalism, but that's probably a conversation for another episode of Wisconsin in Focus down the road.
And one last element I want to bring up, but we're just about out of time, Ben, and that is you mentioned these measures seem to pull well across the state, but what we don't know is if they do get on the ballot before voters, how much money is going to be poured in to either both support and or oppose it. We know from the last Wisconsin Supreme Court election, there were millions of dollars of out-of-state money poured into that election, and that can have an influence, particularly when you're in the gray area of misinformation/actual information. But anyway, we'll have to find out how it goes. Ben, we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with this story and more. For Ben Yount, I'm Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe.